Jason Aldean's divisive hideout in a small town, revealing a culture war split in country music.
The country world has always been a sort of let's all get along atmosphere, and that seems like that's crumbling a bit.
We need someone to mute, although it's a great report on country music.
Happy equinox, everyone.
Oh, thanks, Jill.
Did we get closed captions?
I can't, I don't believe I can. I don't have workshop. I only have meeting. But if you could tell me how to do it.
Well, usually they just come up in the menu bar at the bottom, but I'm not seeing them there. If they're not there, then I'll have to leave and look for a recording later.
Yeah, I don't think I have that version, but I know it's wonderful. The commissioners have something called workshop, but I've never seen
Okay,
that.
well, if you don't have those, then I'm gonna have to leave.
I'm so sorry. I'm looking just to be sure, but
I say often it's in the toolbar, but I guess if you haven't set it up at that end, then you don't have that option.
yeah, maybe it's something I have to set up. It's not normally, you know, the options
I
are.
understand that you have to set it up before the meeting. For some reason, you can't do it once the meeting starts. So if you don't have it automatically in your settings, then I guess.
Okay.
So
I'm so sorry, Owen. I'll try to
I'll
get
have access to a recording though. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, Patrick is working out some audio issues. Blaze and Megan have said that they will appreciate the recording as they couldn't make it at 10. Do we want to give us another minute or so, or should we get rolling?
Maybe start with introductions and as folks come in, if they still do.
Okay, so I just want to say good morning and thank you all for joining us today. We'll do a quick round of introductions, your name, your organization, anything else quick you'd like to share. And as I said, for anyone who can't make it this morning, or those of us that want to come back to this, we are recording today's workshop. So I'm excited to be hosting this with Tammy Picorni, the Natural Resources Program Coordinator at Jefferson County Environmental Public Health. Do you want to introduce yourself first, Tammy?
Sure, that's great. That's most of it. My job title here is Natural Resources Program Coordinator, and I do some work on floodplains, and that's why I'm particularly interested in this topic. Thanks.
And I'm Sierra Young. I'm a conservation planner at Jefferson County Conservation District, here to learn with all of you and also be able to take this knowledge out to the work I do with landowners. And Carrie, will have you go last. I'll give you a little introduction. So Kelly, do you want to go next?
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Kelly Henwood, and I'm the Regional Small Farms Coordinator for our Washington State University Extension Office here in Jefferson County. I also work in Clallam and Kitsap County. So I'm here because Sierra invited me, and we work with a lot of landowners who have not only ag land, but also some forest land owners incorporating agroforestry practices on their farms. So I'm here to just learn and connect and see if I can keep in touch with other resources. And I see that Patrick Schultz is here from WSU as well. So Patrick and I sometimes send people each other's way when we're working with landowners. So just part of the extension network in general. Thanks for having me. Patrick, do you want to go next?
Good segue. Hi, Golly. Yeah, so I'm Patrick Schultz. I'm an extension forester with Wazoo. I cover all of Southwest Washington, and as part of my program, I include quite a bit of agroforestry work and programming. And some people know me as like the big leaf maple syrup guy now, so whether I like it or not. But I work very closely with Carrie, and we're on the board for Agroforestry Northwest together as well. And I think she might have me chime in on a couple of our slides.
All right. I'm just going in the order on my screen. Dave, go next. Maybe still listening to the country music. Aaron, are you still connecting? How about Sherry Schold?
I'm here.
Do you want to introduce yourself quickly?
Oh, okay. Sorry. I'm Sherry Schold, Chief Deputy in Jefferson County Assessor's Office. Tammy invited me to the meeting. I work with the DFL programs in our county.
Thank you for being here. Let's see about
Okay.
Josh Peters.
Good morning, everybody. Josh Peters, Community Development Director for Jefferson County.
Thanks for coming. Let's see who's still connected. Jill, are you there?
Jill, I'm here, if you did. Good morning, everyone. Great to see some faces I haven't seen in a long time. I'm Jill Silver with 10,000 Years Institute, the nonprofit out of Forks, working on invasives and restoration forestry and river science and conservation from Lake Crescent down to ocean shores. And since I eat 5 gallons of maple syrup a year, I'm super interested in big leaf maple syrup and doing some work with Tammy Picorni on the Hoh River and looking at possible agroforestry on the Hoh River. Thank you. Looking forward. Oh, and Allison Frick is joining us today. She's new with us and does invasives and is also has a forestry background and is going to be engaging in this. So I wanted her to come along. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Did you want to add anything else, Allison?
Oh, sorry, Allison Frick. I'm working with Jill, 10,000 Years Institute, again, with the invasives and restoration forestry. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you. Anna.
Hi, big mommy. There we go. Sorry, I'm on my phone. Anna Geffrey. I coordinate the North Pacific Coast Lead Entity. Tammy's one of our representatives, and I don't really know anything about agroforestry, so I'm mostly here to learn and excited to hear about what's going on. So thanks.
Thanks for being here. Sarah.
Hi, folks. I won't have a video up. I'm nursing a mountain bike injury. But I'm Sarah Doyle with the North Olympic Salmon Coalition. We work with a lot of landowners and entities across the peninsula doing riparian restoration. Yeah.
Thank you. Let's see, did Aaron get connected yet?
Yeah, sorry, can you hear me?
Yep. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah, we're just in introductions, right?
Yep.
Oh, okay, yeah. Aaron Oman, I'm the soil conservationist for the National Resources Conservation Service, an agency with USDA. Yeah, I have some interest in agroforestry, studied it in my undergrad. And yeah, happy to be here.
Thank you. And Dave, if you're there. Okay. I'll go ahead and introduce Carrie then. We're fortunate to have Carrie Brausieck from Snohomish. Oh, Dave, are you there?
Yes, sorry. I'm also on my Zoom on phone, which I'm not totally familiar with. Just figured out the audio issues. I live in Chimicum. My wife and I have just started a horse farming operation to reintroduce draft animal power to the Chimicum Valley. And I have done some logging with my horses on our own property this past winter, thinning out some alder, and super excited about learning about all the potential applications, ways that I can use my horses in agroforestry. Thanks.
Thanks, Dave. Sorry to interrupt you there. So we're fortunate to have Carrie here from Snohomish Conservation District and also the president of Agroforestry Northwest presenting for us this morning. Carrie is an agroforester, environmental and natural resource specialist with broad experience and interest in areas such as environmental anthropology, climate change mitigation and adaptation, conservation, environmental policy and security, and sustainability. Her current work and passion revolves around agroecosystems and biocultural restoration of working lands, especially riparian zones. She has broad overseas experience to include working in Germany, Russia, Egypt, Macedonia, and traveled to North and South Africa and all over Europe and Eastern Europe. She has a passion for working with diversity in people, in opinions, in culture, and within the environment. So, Carrie, thank you so much for being here today, and we'll pass it off to you.
Great, thank you. Yeah, let me get this shared. All right, there we go. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and really excited to talk about agroforestry. We have about 2 hours with each other today, and this is the first of 2 presentations that I will be giving. We'll get to have a little bit of a break in between and get more tea or coffee. So this first presentation that I'm going to give is going to be an overview of agroforestry. And I am the president and co-founder of Agroforestry Northwest. Do want to talk about that organization very briefly here. This is a new nonprofit in Washington State. And we are really looking to become a hub for professionals that are interested in working with agroforestry in our region. So we're the first organization of our kind in the Pacific Northwest, and we do a lot of work around awareness building, education and outreach. We foster research in agroforestry systems. We plant trial sites and collect data and do all kinds of things around agroforestry. So if you have interest in agroforestry and you want to engage more, you want to learn more after our presentations today, I would encourage you all to check out this website to join the mailing list. And we do hold a bi-monthly work group meeting so every other month we have a professional in the agroforestry world come and present to us on relevant topics. And then we have a great networking session after that. So we can share information, ask questions of one another, share resources, collaborate. So it's a great way to kind of stay plugged in and see what other professionals are working in the space. And it looks like I might have frozen. Can you all still hear me? Hopefully.
I can still hear you.
Great. Okay, I'll keep going on. Maybe I'll stop my camera briefly, but yeah, it's a great way to stay connected with agroforestry in Washington. And just to give you an idea of where we sit in the broader scope of things, we have partnerships, connections, relationships with all kinds of different entities at the national level, state level, and certainly at local levels as well. We're always looking to collaborate and build networks around agroforestry. So just to give you all an idea of what we're going to talk about with this first presentation, I heard as people introduce themselves various levels of familiarity with agroforestry. So I am going to take time here just to get us all on the same page. I do a lot of presentations. I talk to a lot of different folks about agroforestry and what it is. And there are various levels of understanding out there and some misconceptions at times. So want to define agroforestry for all of us and really have us all understand what it is and what its potentials are. And especially in the context of climate change, of resilience and adaptation. And then I am going to talk about some considerations for these systems with our working lands. So there are a lot of definitions of agroforestry that exist. I like this one. I think this is a great descriptive definition of what agroforestry is. Agroforestry is certainly multidisciplinary. It draws on the sciences of forestry, agronomy, it draws on ecology, it draws on the social sciences of anthropology and sociology. It can have economic aspects to it as well. So a very multidisciplinary approach to the land. What we are doing is we are integrating trees into our working lands. And we are integrating trees with crops, trees with livestock. We're working within forest ecosystems, and this can be simultaneously or sequentially on the same unit of land. What I really want you to focus on here are these last three points that I did highlight in this definition. And these systems are multifunctional. So what we see at the end here is these systems are designed to increase yield, one function. They are designed to realize ecological benefits, another function. And they are designed to maximize ecosystem services. So these systems are designed, they are implemented, they are managed for all three of these functions on the landscape at the same time. We don't design and manage these systems for any one of these functions over and above the others. These are co-equal goals, co-equal functions of an agroforestry system. And there are two basic approaches that we have to agroforestry. The first approach is to go into open lands, open pasture, open croplands, other open spaces, and to reintegrate productive trees and or shrubs. So that's one approach. The other approach that we have with agroforestry is to go into an already forested ecosystem and to begin to intentionally integrate, intentionally cultivate foods, medicines, materials within that forest understory. So it's not about foraging or wildcrafting, but actually the intentional cultivation within that forest ecosystem. So those are the two basic approaches that we have when it comes to these systems. And agroforestry really represents many, many options. With the integration of multiple land uses into one system, we get a wide range of what we can design and what we can implement. Agroforestry is very broad in scope, it's broad in scale, and it's very creative. And we see it expressed across the landscape in all kinds of different ways. So depending on how we choose to integrate these different components of a system, we can come up with all kinds of different things that can address landowner concerns, community concerns, ecological concerns, all types of different things. And I do have to point out that this is nothing new. Agroforestry has been used by indigenous peoples all over the world for thousands of years. Certainly here in our own environment, in our own ecosystems, the indigenous folks here practiced forms of agroforestry. They didn't call it agroforestry, but they certainly had practices that are agroforestry in nature. I'm pointing here to a research paper that was recently published about some of these systems. And many of you may have seen this paper. If not, it's worth checking out. But scientists were studying these remnant forest gardens, as they termed them, around British Columbia. And what they found is that these plant communities within these forest ecosystems would not have existed without humans. So these plant communities were selected, they were brought to this place, they were planted, and they were cultivated to meet human needs. What's interesting about these plant communities and these forest gardens is not only did they meet the needs of the humans that tended them, but they actually had a positive ecological effect on the broader ecosystem. So they increased habitat for birds, for mammals, they increased biodiversity, and had this overall positive ecological impact. So really looking at humans in their environment as a keystone species, intending and meeting their needs this way. And really, it's only been in the last, 150 years or so that in our environment, especially, we've sort of gotten away from these ways of meeting human needs and tending landscapes. And this relationship to place as well. And this is a new program that's been recently started or is about to be started. And I'm going to let Patrick chime in here about this really quickly.
Sure, thanks, Carrie. Yeah, so this is a project that is led by EcoTrust, and WSU Extension is one of many partners. I'm the lead for WSU. The general idea here is creating an indigenous agroforestry community of practice that gathers traditional ecological knowledge from tribes and indigenous communities that are practicing agroforestry or interested in practicing agroforestry for the purposes of sharing that information between each other, sort of a peer-to-peer learning, and increasing those practices across the landscape for community resiliency, obviously environmental resiliency. So it's kind of coming in 3 stages right now. It's all about outreach, identifying those communities that are practicing or are interested in practicing. Then there's going to be a needs assessment to help identify, what they need to continue to do it or adopt the practices. And this is a federally funded program, so part of it too is to use that needs assessment to increase access to federal programs. So it's rolling out over the next 3 or 4 years. Again, this EcoTrust project, Stephanie Gutierrez, if you know her, this is kind of her baby. But if you want more information, I'll plug in the website, and I can field questions as well if you want to email me or ask later.
Thanks, Patrick. So, as I said before, agroforestry systems are broad in scope. They are expressed, we see them across the land in all kinds of various forms and ways that they've been integrated. We certainly have a lot of people that we find that have been practicing forms of agroforestry, but they may not contextualize it that way. They may not call it agroforestry. We find folks that are saying that they're practicing agroforestry, but they may not really be doing that. So how do we identify what an agroforestry system really is? How do we make sure that we're designing and managing a real agroforestry system? So in agroforestry, we have what we call the 4 I's. And this really helps us really identify when agroforestry is really occurring on the landscape, or helps us to design for a true agroforestry system. So agroforestry systems are first and foremost, they are intentional. They're not by mistake or accident. They really are intentionally thought out, intentionally designed. Species are selected to be integrated with each other towards these multiple benefits that I talked about earlier. And they are managed for those benefits as well. These systems are integrated. So the components are structurally and functionally integrated with each other. So an orchard, for example, even though that's trees on farmland, would not be considered agroforestry because we only have one component there. For an orchard to be converted into agroforestry, it would need to be integrated with another component. It might need an understory crop that would be integrated in. It might have some livestock and some forages that are integrated into that system. So it's an integrated, intentional system. These systems are also intensively managed. It's not just about throwing some trees on the back 5 acres and walking away and hoping for the best. They really take active management and they take adaptive management because we're working in trees, because we're working in perennial systems. These systems change and they adapt over time. So an agroforestry system that was planted yesterday is going to look very different. It's going to have very different production. It's going to have different management than that same system 10 years down the road or even 20 years down the road. Lastly, agroforestry systems are interactive. So the components that are selected interact with one another towards the co-benefits that we want to have from these systems. In North America, the USDA defines these 5 basic or buckets of agroforestry practices, these 5 categories. And we see all kinds of different creative things, but essentially any agroforestry practice would be put into one of these 5 categories. So we have alley cropping, we have forest farming, we have riparian forest buffers. Those actually are a defined agroforestry practice by the USDA. We have silvopasture and we have windbreaks. And I'll touch on each of those very briefly. I do want to talk a little bit about the spectrum of agroforestry practices as well, because depending on who I'm talking to, there are a lot of different impressions that form around what an agroforestry system might be and what it might mean. Agroforestry systems, like I said, and I'll say it again, they're very broad in scope and application. So we can have at one end of the spectrum an agroforestry system that might be very large in scale. It might be more industrialized, like we might used to be seeing in, some commodity type of farm systems. So that is one end of the scale of agroforestry systems. And then there's this whole spectrum that can go all the way down to what I would say is the other end of the scale that can be more ecologically based systems that are designed first and foremost for ecological function or for restoration, and that have some sort of gentle use productive component tacked onto them. So we have this very broad spectrum of systems. Alley cropping is one of those systems that we could scale up and make more industrialized. This is a system that is going to be much more a farmer that's doing some commodity cropping or row cropping or has really heat in production. This is going to be a system that's going to be easier for them to transition to. What we are doing with alley cropping is we are coming in to an existing operation and we are inserting or integrating rows of productive trees. So these could be trees for timber, they could be for food. These trees could be for additional forage for livestock. There are many trees that provide very valuable forage for all types of livestock. So we would integrate these trees in these rows within the existing operation, and we would account for the existing management, the equipment that is being used, and all of those things. So adding in this other layer of production into an existing system, and then getting all the benefits that trees provide when they're integrated into lands. Forest farming and food forests. We're really working with forest ecosystem structure here. And this was one of the approaches that I mentioned earlier. So forest farming is going in to an already established forest ecosystem and beginning to cultivate foods, medicines, materials in the forest understory in some way. Um, there is another approach here that we call food forests, and this would be going into open land and constructing or mimicking a forest ecosystem with productive trees, shrubs, understory plants, and things like that. This graphic here, I think, is pretty cool. It shows all the different production and benefits that we can get out of a complex system like this. So we have carbon sequestration, we have increased biodiversity and habitat, air purification, nutrient cycling, soil building, water filtration, all while we can be producing fruit or honey or seeds or medicines or whatever it is. So very complex, very productive systems. Riparian forest buffers. I'm sure that all of us here today are highly aware of what riparian forest buffers are, so I'm not going to spend time defining that. I do have the word harvestable here, or I could insert the word productive. So we are really looking at bringing harvestable or productive ways of constructing riparian forest buffers here in Western Washington. And there are a lot of reasons we are doing that. And I'm going to get into that a little bit more in the next presentation, but definitely one of our agroforestry practices. Silvopasture. I am out driving around, farmland frequently, driving around big open pasture spaces, and I see this image a lot. And I'm sure we've all seen this at some point in time, where for whatever reason, there's that one random tree in a big open pasture that has managed to survive there and exist. And it's a hot day or there's a ton of rain coming down, and I see this image so often where the livestock are just huddled under that one tree as close as they can get. Silvopasture is the integration of trees into pasture and the integration with livestock and forages. And we have more and more research showing the benefits of trees to a lot of livestock and the benefits of that integration. These are images of, I would say, probably the livestock that work the best in silvopasture systems. So certainly cows work very well, sheep do very, very well, and chickens are amazing in a silvopastured type of system. These are really, really cool synergistic systems where we can see benefits on all of the components. So we see benefits for the pasture production, for the forage production. We see certainly benefits to the livestock, and we see even benefits to the tree components in these systems. So they're really, really interesting systems. And lastly, windbreaks. These are dense plantings in hedges, in almost like walls, dense walls, living fences, if you will, of trees and shrubs meant really for protection, for shelter, for from prevailing winds, for crops, for livestock, things like that. These can have components of plants for pollinators and songbirds and things like that. They can have some productive plants inserted into them, but their main function is for those sheltering aspects from prevailing weather events and that kind of thing. So we've defined agroforestry. We've talked about the 4 I's. We have talked about each practice. I want to talk about agroforestry and its potentials for things like climate change, for adaptation, and that type of thing. And this is a classic graphic that's been going around for several years now. Tammy may have sent this out. I know I saw that she included it in some things. This is from Project Drawdown, and it shows some research around different types of land uses and their potential to sequester carbon and store carbon. And they are looking at gigatons of CO2 equivalents per year here. And we see various forms of land management along the bottom there, and some being, promising for carbon sequestration, grazing management for one, forest management certainly. And then we see agroforestry, and it starts to rise above the other systems. And research that is coming out tends to be pointing in this direction, that agroforestry for carbon sequestration is incredibly promising. And the authors, I will read this quote really quickly. They say that with even a modest level of adoption, agroforestry could sequester 2.2 gigatons of carbon per year, more than any other agricultural land management approach out there. And this was in 2012. And 10 years later, we are still seeing the same thing in research. The agroforestry can sequester more carbon than any other land management approach that we see. They go on to ask, how much more carbon could we store if agroforestry were widely adopted? So as we're thinking about our working lands and mitigating for climate change, agroforestry is really something we should be thinking about and thinking about investing in, and thinking about encouraging and making it easier for our farmers, for our land managers to adopt these practices. This is a graphic that was done for Washington State. So this brings it here local. Again, on the left-hand side, we see gigatons of carbon per acre per year. Along the bottom, we see various types of farming practices. And what we see on the right-hand side are different counties in Washington State. This graphic was put together by Dr. Lynn Carpenter-Boggs from WSU, and she was looking at different farming practices in Washington and their potential for carbon sequestration. And the reason she chose different counties is because these counties represent different soil types and different climate types within Washington State. And the type of climate, the types of soils you have impact the amount of carbon that you can capture and store. And so that's what she was doing with representing these different counties. And we can see that various farming practices have potential for carbon sequestration. Rotational grazing looks good. Mulching of soils looks really good. And then we start to integrate trees into our farmlands. And we really get a huge carbon sequestration and storage potential. Agroforestry is also being looked at and studied more and more for adaptation. Even if we were to stop emitting, greenhouse gases tomorrow, we still have change that is built into our system for years to come. And so we really need to be looking at how we're adapting to that change. And agroforestry is being studied for this. This is a graphic that I don't expect you to read or make sense of. I will explain this here. It was a study that looked at research from all over the globe and was looking at all these different ways that we interact with our lands, from agriculture to forestry to how we treat soils, to even like supply and demand systems and things like that. And they were looking at these different categories, these different land interactions, if you will, and their ability to have positive effects across these four categories: climate change mitigation, climate change adaptation, land degradation, and food security. And so you see this little color-coded chart, and essentially what this is showing is this dark blue color being the most positive effect across these 4 categories. And then we have this mid blue having a good effect and light blue having so-so, and then we have other categories. But what I want to point out here is that agroforestry is one of the few things within this whole list that they analyzed that has a positive effect across all of these categories. Positive for mitigation, we just talked about that. Very positive for adaptation, for land degradation, for restoration of degraded lands, and for food security. And this is a great graphic put out by the USDA, the National Agroforestry Center. They have here this column of risk, different types of risk that we face from climate change. Then in the second column here, they have how we would need to adapt in relationship to that risk. And then in the third column here, they have the agroforestry practice that would be appropriate for that adaptation to manage that risk. So it's a really cool chart. We can take one here, increasing temperatures, right? We're feeling that here in Western Washington, certainly. And so what we need to do for increasing temperatures is reduce heat stress on our animals. We need to provide shade. I would even throw in our streams and rivers in here. We certainly need to make sure that we're keeping temperatures low in our rivers and streams, and we're providing shade to those. And so for animal stress, for heat stress, they have silvopasture here. I would go ahead and I would tack on riparian forest buffers as well for Western Washington. But a really cool chart to see what types of agroforestry practices can help us towards adaptation on our working lands in all kinds of various ways. So agroforestry is a very, very cool way to steward our lands. But I will acknowledge that it is not always the most appropriate approach. There are many considerations that we need to take into account when deciding where and when to integrate agroforestry practices. We need to really think about what resource concerns are present on the ground and what we're addressing. We need to take into consideration our landowners and their goals. Agroforestry may not fit with a certain landowner's goals or what they need from their landscape. We need to take into account the ecological conditions. Agroforestry may not be appropriate in certain ecological conditions that we might have. We also need to take into account existing markets and potential. These systems are productive. That is one of the components. That is one of the functions of an agroforestry system. So taking into account what types of production we are integrating in these systems, and if there are markets for that production, can be very important. And we need to take into account existing land management, equipment, all of those types of things that might be going on where we are integrating these systems. We also, with agroforestry, because it's multifunctional, because it's multidisciplinary, it really exists at the crossroads or at this nexus point between lots of different institutions and policies and things like that. So we really need to consider what types of regulation we might have layered in on the landscape. We need to consider programs that might assist with the adoption of agroforestry, and what some of the caveats on those programs might be. I think of programs for riparian forest buffers, for example. Federal programs like CREP. Do they have a no-touch component to their program, right? These are all considerations. Regulations from federal, state, local levels. Are there buffer width tables we need to be considering? Are there agricultural easements that are on the landscape, or certain taxation codes that may be a barrier to putting agroforestry on the ground? I will say I've done a lot of installation of agroforestry systems in North Puget Sound area and haven't run into too many regulatory issues that have gotten in the way. Although I have talked to others that have run into some of this. And so these are definitely, and they've run into this more at the local level, local county government, local city government, whatever it is. And so I think having conversations, building awareness about what these systems are and what they're doing are very important with a lot of our regulators and our policymakers. There are also cultural contexts to consider. I have seen a landowner come in and, you know, they may have a lot of commodity type farmers around them, adjacent to them, and they decide they want to implement agroforestry, and they can have some neighborly social pressures around putting trees in their farmland. I have also seen it work the other way, where we will have someone come in and plant out an agroforestry system, and the neighbors kind of watch them and, you know, maybe come for a visit and ask some questions. And then a couple of years later, the farmer down the road is putting in some agroforestry. And then a couple of years after that, the farmer at the end of the road is putting in some agroforestry. So we've definitely seen these different cultural contexts playing out as well when we are integrating agroforestry into our working lands. And so I'm gonna sum this up. Agroforestry is a multifunctional approach to the land. It can address a wide range of landowner goals, of concerns, of ecological concerns. It has the potential to help mitigate for climate change, and certainly has the potential to help us adapt to a changing climate. And I didn't spend any time talking about a lot of the other benefits that agroforestry systems have, the soil health benefits that they have, the water quality benefits, the biodiversity and habitat benefits. So these systems have a lot of benefits that we can talk about, and I just had time to touch on a few. These systems really do need to be carefully considered and designed and managed. We need to consider ecological context, social context, economic and political contexts. And we need to work to identify and break down the barriers to adoption for these systems, especially within some of our policy and regulatory constructs. So that is what I have for this first presentation. This is my contact information, and this is Patrick's contact information. You are always welcome to reach out to us for any questions, concerns, conversations, anything you might have around agroforestry. And yeah, I don't know if we want to take some time for questions, or if we want a little break.
I think, why don't we give some time for questions and then a short break? And I know that there was a mistake in the calendar invite, so I wonder if a few more people might be joining us right at 11. So maybe aim to start the next presentation then, unless our conversation is taking us a little bit beyond that. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Carrie. That was really a wonderful presentation. Does anyone here have questions for Carrie or for anyone else here? You know, we have a lot of knowledge in the room with us today, coming at this from different angles.
Yeah, I have a question. Hi, this is Kelly. Thank you so much, Carrie. That was so incredible and informative. And every slide, I was just eating up all the information that you were sharing with us. I was particularly struck by the climate change slides and the adaptations, and that just as an extension professional, I just was really inspired by that the information, how it was laid out, and what people can do in a practical sense to respond to some of that. A question I have that came up for me is when I'm working with farmers and landowners who are not only interested in some of these practices, but maybe are more in the commercial crop production side of agriculture. In some of your slides, you mentioned nutrient management and soil health. And I was just wondering if you could speak to how that's monitored within agroforestry systems, and maybe some similarities or differences on how that would be either similar or different for some of these crop producers who maybe want to incorporate some of these practices.
Yeah, so I would say that how nutrient management is monitored in an agroforestry system would be probably not too different than in a conventional productive system. It's going to be soil testing at the right times. It's going to be, looking at what crops you're producing and making decisions about what applications you might need or amendments. I will say that, usually for nutrient management, we're really looking at the chemical makeup of the soil and what's going on there. I will say in agroforestry systems, as far as overall soil health, and this is, being embraced more and more in commercial ag too, is looking at some of the other components within the soil profile, the biological components, certainly the organic matter and that kind of thing, especially if we're looking for is this system, storing carbon, and those types of things. I will say what we do see, there's research in agroforestry systems that as you get trees integrated into a productive farm, we do see that there are times when actual inputs of nutrients might be reduced. So you might save money on the input of nutrients because trees are very good at starting to cycle nutrients through the system much more efficiently than if they are absent from the system. They also provide what is termed in the literature as a safety net, so that if there is over application or there are nutrients that are not taken up by crops, that trees will usually, and their root systems will usually intercept those excess nutrients. So yeah, we see greater nutrient cycling. I mean, when you put a tree in the ground and you think about the root system that a tree has within the soil profile, we see the biological activity just amplify and increase. And I think because of that, you get this much more efficient nutrient cycling within that system. So is that, and Patrick can add any more if I've missed something, but does that address your question?
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and if anyone has comments too, or open to just conversation as well about anything here.
I got a question. Aaron Oman here.
Yeah.
Hi, nice to meet you, Carrie. I'm just like, could you expand a little bit or point us to some resources or pools of knowledge with respect to traditional ecological knowledge and tech design, or just like in the Pacific maritime climate here in the Northwest, or where would I look?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. Patrick may have some good resources with the work he's doing. That one study that was on the slide, is a good place to start. I know there are some, I would say, I mean, it can be hard to find some of that information. I want to say it's the, and I'll go back and look through my resources, and maybe what I can do is send out some additional resources that you all may want to have through Sierra and Tammy to the broader group. I know there's, I want to say, is it the Quinault tribe? One of the tribes has done a really, really good job about documenting some of that, and some of their traditional sort of agroforestry types of practices and knowledge, and made it public. I know there's some work that other tribes are doing around certain crops and bringing back sort of traditional management systems. I know the Tulalip tribes up in my area were doing a lot of work around their sort of traditional forest farming techniques with huckleberry, for example. But I don't think they have a lot of public information about that. So yeah, I know I have some resources that I will share out through Sierra. And Patrick, if you know of any good resources as well.
Yeah, well, I'll say if you're interested in that, and if you weren't around for the slide on the Indigenous Agroforestry Community of Practice, I can put that website back in the chat. And I would just say there's a newsletter that you can sign up for, and hopefully as the project rolls out, there'll be more activity on that. But the study that you pointed out, Carrie, is a really good one. And I know the University of Washington, I was trying to find it, they have an ethnobotany database that I've gone back to several times. I just need to find the link, and maybe you're familiar with that one as well. But I'd say in general that area of study is really increasing right now. And in fact, Washington State University is in the process of hiring a faculty position that would actually be focused a lot on traditional ecological knowledge. So maybe more to come.
Okay, great. Thanks for your time.
I had a question, and I think Josh may have been the one who could answer it, and he had to hop off for another commitment, but maybe Sherry could answer this. With the forest farming practice that could potentially be expanding an ag footprint into what was previously forest land, does that present any issues as far as county regulations are concerned?
No, we're not. I mean, we've talked to some DNR folks, and again, Patrick can jump in here. We've talked to some DNR folks about this, and we're not finding too much that gets in the way of this. And it's all about it's all about how this is designed and managed as well. And I'm going to actually address this much more in depth in the next presentation. I'm going to talk about forest farming and its potential in our region and the way that we're looking at designing and implementing it. So I think that's a really important component. It's not, it's not about like layering like traditional kind of egg into a forest understory where we're going to go in and strip out the understory and plant in broccoli or something, right? It's very intentionally designed, again, for not only production, but the ecological functions and biodiversity and things like that we want within our forest ecosystem. So yeah, I'll get into that a little more in the next presentation, and hopefully that'll provide some clarity. But yeah, we've done exploring around where regulation might be getting in the way and haven't found a lot. Unless, Patrick, do you have?
I could just jump in and say you're right, and there's layers of regulation, right? But we've talked with the DNR in regards to their forest practice rules and have found that there's no issues there. The only issue that could really maybe run into is with local counties that might, especially those that are more sticklers around like the designated forest land tax status program. I have heard it could be made, the argument could be made that if your primary source of income from that land becomes something other than timber, then they could make the case that you should be removed from the program. I've never seen that done, and most counties, you kind of deal with them locally. And as long as you're still managing for timber, which is the objective of that program, you should be fine. So it's kind of a case by case, but so far, like Carrie said, I haven't really run into serious issues.
Thank you. And would that be the same case if you were to apply silvopasture and bring livestock into the understory?
Yeah, pretty much. And I've had people do that successfully, and then I've had some people get pushback from the county, but I haven't yet run into anyone where the county said, no, you can't do that.
I will say though, I have run into instances where at the local level with certain tax, like open space tax type of structures that they may have layered in, to the overall state one, that because with true silvopasture, you have to do a modicum of thinning, and to really get the forage component to thrive. And so I've seen that if so there's two approaches to silvopasture. One is to put trees into open pasture, but the other is certainly to go into already forested space. So I have seen that if they're trying to get into a forested area and thin out enough to get the pasture established, then that can get in the way of their whatever tax structure that their land is in.
Yeah, especially for the designated forest land program. And
Yeah.
and the lower limit, I believe, is 90 trees per acre, which is
Right.
pretty low.
Yeah.
But in some cases you could be approaching that with silvopasture. So it's a little harder to get away with than forest farming.
Yeah. Okay, I am gonna.
I see that Tammy also has her hand up.
Hi, I just have this overarching concern about the herbaceous and woody understories and how fragile and rare they are thanks to invasive species and so many challenges. And so I hope that there are some metrics on how vulnerable those plant communities are. I think my guess is they're increasingly rare. And also the impacts of converting from native forests with respect to hydrology, because drought is such an overarching concern for everything, and soil health being a big part of that. But anyway, thank you. It's more of a comment, I guess, but I'm interested in any thoughts you might add on that in your next presentation.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're going to dive into that more in the next presentation. And so that'll be a great discussion, I think, around that at that point. And Jill, do you have your hand up?
Thank you so much. So interesting. Beautiful graphics too. Appreciated them. I am curious and adjusting to the amount of pastoral grasses, non-native pasture grasses, really densely embedded around things that folks are trying to plant, and what you suggest about the distance or the treatment of or the opening up for other species growing, particularly trees, but also native shrubs or non-native shrubs, blueberries.
So what
in pasture grasses?
What
converting some pasture land to forest, and how do you recommend dealing with the competitiveness of pasture grass?
Yeah, I it's a hard one, right? I would say, if you've done riparian restoration in reed canary grass, or these old pastured systems where these grasses are just, oh my God, it's very similar. it's a hard scenario. Oh gosh, I've looked into, I mean, we're playing we're playing with the same types of issues and trying to find solutions, just like the restoration community is, to be honest. It's I don't know if we have any silver bullets. We're using a lot of the same techniques. I've done some looking into potentially burning in some areas when appropriate and where appropriate, as a technique, which I would really like to explore more. Yeah.
We have an entire reed canary grass protocol, and we do hundreds and hundreds of acres of I'm going to share that with you, actually. So really used to that, and we are probably going to be using aquatic glyphosate on pasture, on strips of pasture where we want to interplant trees. And I'm going to lose the internet connection probably, so already done so. Anyway, I'll stop there, but I appreciate the conversation and would like to continue it.
Yeah, and I think
Thank
I heard
you.
you say, you cut out a little bit, but I heard you say something about glyphosate, and that can be a tool. Sometimes when we're inserting productive trees that are going to produce some kind of food, or shrubs that are going to produce food, some landowners don't want the use of those things. And so we have to try and find physical or, other types of ways. But yeah, there's lots of different tools in the toolbox. And yeah, it's always, I'm always trying to increase my knowledge and expand the toolbox and the techniques, because it's just, yeah, it's hard. Reed
Thanks
canary
for that,
grass
Carrie.
is a special thing. Yeah.
Yeah. So aquatic glyphosate, just for everybody, it's the best restoration tool, and it's the best tool for replanting in, because it binds so tightly with sediment, doesn't move in water, degrades really rapidly, and it's just perfect for that situation in my mind. And I am organic girl on the other end of the entire spectrum. So there you have it. Last thing I'm just going to say to all of us is, let's talk about biochar, incorporating biochar into agroforestry, using the cuttings from the agroforestry operations or the forestry operations to create char, and incorporating char in order to increase carbon and microbial structures and soil water. So just want to talk about that at some point, if we can expand that. Thank you, Kelly.
Yeah,
I see
and
your comment.
That's great. I think I can bring that up too in the next presentation. There are scenarios where we're starting to look at incorporating that. So I'm glad you mentioned biochar. Thank you, Jill. That's great.
Great, thanks. Over and out.
Thank you, Jill. We have a couple people that joined us a little bit later. Would Randy and Marlo like to just really briefly introduce who you are and who you're with before we get going with the second presentation?
Hi, I'm Marlo. I'm here from Jefferson Land Trust. I work in our stewardship program. Excited to be here. Thanks.
Hello, I'm Randy Johnson, and I serve as the Habitat Program Manager for the Jamestown Squamish Tribe. Thank you.
Thank you both. So Carrie, if you're ready, I guess we can keep rolling.
Yeah, thanks. Presentation number 2. Yeah, if you're just joining us, I'm Carrie. I'm a co-founder and president of Agroforestry Northwest, and I have my colleague Patrick Schultz here with me today as well, to talk about a few slides and to help answer questions. So if you are just joining us, in the first presentation, we just talked about really what agroforestry is. We defined it, we talked about what its potentials are, especially in the face of climate change and adaptation and things like that. So in this presentation, we're going to sort of focus in more on Western Washington, on the challenges that we have in Western Washington, on some of our working lands and some of our restoration, that we try and do, and then how agroforestry can address some of these challenges on these landscapes. I'm going to introduce a little bit about biocultural restoration and how that construct is fitting in with the work that we are working on. And then briefly talk about what some next steps might be around the further adoption of agroforestry for some of these challenges. I know that all of us on this call today, or on this presentation today, are probably very familiar with these challenges, but I am just going to talk through these very briefly, address some of these challenges just to set this context, this backdrop, if you will, of what we're applying agroforestry to help try and address. Certainly we've got threatened salmon species. We have endangered resident orca in our region. We have billions that have been spent to address our wild salmon populations, but unfortunately the numbers do continue to decline. And there are many, many reasons for that decline. A lot of those reasons are linked to the ways that we use our lands. And we do have in our region increasing populations. It's a beautiful area. We've got a relatively mild climate. We have great job opportunities and people are moving here. There are some potentials that we could have a quadrupling, or some estimates that we could have a quadrupling of the population in our region by the end of the century. And thinking about what kind of an impact that might have on our lands. We do have increasing impervious surface, which makes sense with increasing development for more people. We do have an overall forest cover decline. We have private forest owners, private forest lands that are in degraded states. Overall riparian forest cover, especially in the lowlands, is declining. It turns out that both humans and salmon tend to make a lot of use out of the lower elevations of our watershed. So a little bit of competition with resources there. We have a net loss of riparian acres, especially on our agricultural lands. We have increasing marginal acres on our lowland farms as well. So these are just some of the issues that we face in our region. And I'm going to transition now and talk about riparian zones and riparian restoration. Unfortunately, we have a situation where restoration is not quite keeping up with degradation, and there are all kinds of reasons for that. I'm sure many of us on this presentation today are highly aware of all of those different reasons, but I am just going to talk about the private property aspect here. A lot of our riparian miles flow through private property. We have a lot of riparian miles that flow through farmland. And it tends to be politically unpopular to regulate on private property landowners. We like to use carrots as opposed to sticks when it comes to our privately owned lands. So we do have a construct of voluntary compliance in Washington state and actually across the nation, really. And with this construct, what we do is we incentivize our private landowners to plant, to protect, to restore riparian zones on their private properties. And the way we do this, we have these programs in place now, we have these incentives in place. What we tend to do is, whether these be federal programs or state programs, we tend to offer money. So we pay landowners, we pay for trees, we pay for labor, we do installation, and then some of the programs may even pay a yearly stipend or a yearly payment or things like that to a landowner to have them restore and keep these riparian forest buffers on their waterways. We see there's been a lot of social science over the last couple of decades that shows that paying people to restore and protect natural spaces is not a very effective tool. And I'm not saying it never works. There are certainly instances where it works well. But for the scale that we need to get at, for the amount of people we really need to bring in the door, and for the longevity of these systems, paying people is not typically the most effective. And so I said there's this social science out there that shows that. There's also some local surveys that we've done over the years. I know SCD has done one. I know Skagit Watershed Council has done some surveys. And private landowners say this in these surveys here in Washington State, in Western Washington. So I would say that the current incentives are culturally lacking. What landowners also tell us, whether through surveys or whether talking with them or being out on their land with them, they use terms like mistrust, land grab, a lack of understanding of what this riparian buffer is and what it's really doing. So there's a lot of misconceptions, a lot of bad feelings that can take place towards these buffers. And what I didn't say, what I meant to say earlier too, is not only are we paying and installing trees and doing all of this, but what's linked to that is kind of this no-touch concept, right? And I know that various entities are talking about ways that we can address this sort of no-touch concept. But this no-touch concept of let's come in and put in all native trees and shrubs and ask landowners to really stay out of that space is really not speaking to landowners and can really create distrust and misunderstanding and negative feelings. Current incentives can be economically lacking as well. They may not be compensating landowners enough for production that they might be losing on their land, certainly. And what we find, what social science is pointing to, is the amount you're paying people is not, it's not addressing the lack of value, the lack of agency that they feel towards these spaces as well. So we are looking at, and I talked in the previous presentation about the fact that riparian forest buffers are an agroforestry practice. But what we're doing with these spaces, because in Washington State, they're really not defined or recognized that way. They're much more within the purview of the restoration community and linked to all this regulation and all of that. What we're doing in Western Washington is we are looking at layering in additional agroforestry practices into riparian forest buffer spaces to start to address some of these issues. So we're looking at changing our sort of philosophy around how humans can be reintegrated into these riparian forest buffer spaces. And I talked earlier when I had a slide up about indigenous agroforestry practices as this kind of role of humans as a keystone species. What does that mean? And what does that look like in riparian forest buffers, especially with modern day land uses and things like that, and modern day relationships to the land? So we're tackling this through agroforestry within riparian zones and really looking at what it looks like and means to create these meaningful and long-lasting relationships of humans to these restored spaces. And we're using concepts of biocultural restoration. This may be a term that you've all heard before, but if you haven't, it's sort of a construct that is being worked on by many people. One of those people is Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, and many of you may have heard of her or read her gorgeous book, Grading Sweetgrass. But really what this is doing is looking at restoring ecosystems along with cultural relationships. And I am going to read this quote from her. She says that repair of ecosystem structure and function alone is insufficient. And I think we see this on the land. I think that we, certainly landowners tell us this. I think many of us know this in various ways within the roles that we have. I know that when I worked in Northern Virginia for a conservation district, we did riparian restoration on farmlands, and we used the CREP program. And we would, plant a nice riparian buffer through CREP on farmland. And the landowner would sign at the time it was a 10-year contract, and they would sign that contract, and that buffer would exist and do its thing and grow up for 10 years. And then that contract would come to an end. And what we saw was a lot of farmers go in and mow down that buffer and reconvert it back into farmland. Why? I think because we didn't do the second piece of this quote. We did the first piece, but we didn't do the second piece. Restoration of a respectful, reciprocal relationship to the natural world, to these spaces, is also essential for long-term success. And that's what many of the farmers would say. They didn't feel like they had a relationship with that space. They didn't understand it. They feel like they had a loss of agency. And so they took it out. So I think we see this, and certainly here when I'm working with landowners, they express this sentiment as well. And we are in a scenario where we're just going to have more people come and interact in these spaces and want use and want agency and want ownership and want some kind of way to value and interact with these spaces. So what is the goal here? We're looking to increase knowledge and value of riparian buffers. When people can be in these spaces, when they can be interacting with these spaces in an intentional way, we can increase knowledge, we can increase understanding, we can increase value. We're exploring different ways of valuing these spaces. Different ways of valuing these spaces look different to different folks. They look different among different landowners. They look different among different communities. It all depends on the landscape and what people are interacting with that space. We're looking to find other ways to incentivize riparian protection and restoration other than just paying people to do it. And we're exploring what creates relationship to riparian ecosystems. So what is this looking like? What kinds of practices are we layering in to riparian restoration? We are layering in the agroforestry practices of forest farming and food forests. We are layering in the practice of alley cropping at times in the appropriate place with the appropriate landowners. And we are looking at uses such as wildcrafting. We are looking at uses such as producing native seeds and cuttings for restoration in other areas. We are looking at the protection and introduction and cultivation of tribal cultural resources. We are looking at U-pick scenarios. We are looking at research and education. And I do want to talk a bit about design, because I know when I talk about this concept, quite a few people will come back at me and say, so you're planting an orchard up to the edge of the stream, right? I think that's the impression that some people get, is that we're going to plant an orchard up to the end of the stream and we're going to call that a multifunctional riparian forest buffer. That is not what is occurring. We have this zone 1, which is a traditional, fully native riparian forest buffer that is designed for the ecological function that we want on that landscape. That is the first zone. The second zone is still a dense planting and like a riparian forest buffer, but is going to be more of a managed zone where we can do some cultivation, we can have some production, we can be harvesting and that kind of thing. And then we would have a third zone that we are starting to see on some of our landscapes. Landowners are choosing to actually continue agroforestry practices further out off of this into this third zone. And those practices may start to look like silvopasture or other practices, but we are finding that with this kind of concept, when landowners start to use this and integrate with it, they start to expand those trees and shrubs farther out into their farmland in some cases. Or this can look like a transition with pollinator strips or shrubs or things like that, transitioning into the adjacent land use, whether that's row cropping or cattle grazing or hay cutting or whatever it is. I want to show some examples of what this is really looking like, what we're really doing with this. This is Restoration Camp on the Skykomish River. This riparian land is actually recently been acquired by the Tulalip tribes. And we are working in coordination with their natural resources team, who is doing restoration within this riparian zone. And they have collaborated with us to give us certain areas of this riparian restoration space to start to layer in these types of agroforestry practices. And we're really tackling a lot of things in this space. So first off, we are coming to this space very frequently. And we are camping there. So we are spending time. We're not just coming in and chopping it at, invasive species and leaving, and coming in and slamming trees in the ground and going home. We're spending time here. We're coming here and camping at least once a season. And really in the summer, in the spring, in the fall, trying to come several times throughout the season and camp. So we're present here, we are observing what we're doing on the landscape. We are doing site assessments. We are taking stock of existing plant communities. We are doing design. We are holding design charrettes. It's something we did several months ago where we had all types of people from all different disciplines come to this space, look around, and give their expertise to the space. We are, like I said, we're camping here, we're doing the work. We're at this point in battling back invasive species, and we are sharing skills, and we are sharing food, and we are sharing stories, and we're building a community around this space. And we're building a community of people that come back to this space over and over again and feel agency here and have a vested interest in what's going on and are present and are doing a lot here. What you see are pictures here of an area of Japanese knotweed. Pretty much that it was all that was growing in this area of the riparian zone. We are doing some alley cropping techniques in this space to battle back the Japanese knotweed. So we are chopping and dropping that Japanese knotweed in these windrows, and then we let that desiccate in place. And the last camp, we were also pulling a bunch of ivy out of another area of the riparian zone. And we had a woman with us that weaves baskets out of ivy. So people sat around the campfire and they took that ivy and they turned it into baskets that evening. And then she was also able to take the rest of the ivy home and feed it to her goats. So interesting ways to remove invasive species. And here you see a picture of that Japanese knotweed actually having desiccated in these windrows, keeping down regrowth. And what we will do is we will come in probably this planting season, and we will start to plant into those windrows things like alder, cottonwood, some of those earlier successional trees. And then we will chop and drop into the alleyways. As those trees get bigger, we will thin them. We will then insert some conifer species that we may want. And we, in the alleyways, will put in various species of native understory plants that we want to cultivate for seeds, for cuttings, for foods, for medicines. We have had some tribal members come out and generously donate their time to give their input of what types of techniques and culturally important species that they think would be great to produce on this site. So working in the riparian zone here with restoration, with battling noxious weeds, with agroforestry techniques, and making this a productive space, all in native species. This is an example of one of these at a farm, a private farm, Raising Cane Ranch. This gentleman planted a fully native, dense riparian forest buffer on a salmon stream adjacent to his farmland. And then off of that, that zone 1, he planted a second zone that is essentially a food forest. And those are just some of the species that have been integrated into this food forest space. And initially he planted about an acre, and he got kind of used to that. And then this last planting season, he expanded that out to 2 more acres. So lots of trees and shrubs now in that sort of zone adjacent to that waterway. And when you ask him how he values this space, why he chose to expand this food forest aspect, these are the types of words that he uses. This is the way that he has garnered value and agency within this space. I should get updated pictures. This is Pilchuck Julia Landing. This is a public park owned by the city of Snohomish, right on the banks of the Snohomish River. And we did 100-foot riparian forest buffer planting, again, all natives, typical density, typical design, typical species profile within this. And then adjacent to that, we did another 50 feet of a food forest. And what we're getting at here is really inviting the public into this space, to actually actively come into this space. There will be a trail that will run through this forest buffer. It will run between the native planting and the food forest that the public can walk on. We are going to be holding public events here, educating the public about the riparian zone, why it's important, teaching them about the native trees and shrubs, and those that have actual edible or medicinal benefits. And then also teaching them about the food forest that exists and what species are there and what foods they can come and harvest, and how they can use those foods and that kind of thing. So a riparian zone with this food forest component, making that a wider riparian planting, but inviting the public to come to interact, to learn and feel a part of this space. Forest lands. Lots of privately owned forest lands, and this is, another space that we're working in with agroforestry. We have a lot of farmlands that have also owned forest land. The farmer may own 20, 30, 50 acres of forest land adjacent to his farm. We have lots of folks who buy 20 acres of forest land. We see a lot of these lands can be under pressure for conversion to more agriculture. Gosh, I see people come in and want to cut down their 5 acres of forest so they can graze their horse. Certainly, some of our small forest lands are under pressure for development. We find that there can be a lack of knowledge with the ecosystem services that some of these forest stands are providing. And that many small forest landowners don't necessarily see some of these lands as requiring any kind of active management. And we're seeing a lot of degraded stands in these spaces. Landowners being like, oh, well, in 20 years, I'll do a timber harvest, or it's just a space that they go for a walk through every now and then, and it's kind of an afterthought. So we see a lot of noxious weed pressures, a lack of biotic diversity, stands that are way too dense, that need thinning, decreased resilience to climate change, increased risk to fire, those types of things. So looking at bringing in forest farming. Again, if you weren't here for the previous presentation, forest farming is the intentional cultivation of foods, medicines, materials in the forest understory. And what we see is that this brings in an increased presence and management within these forest ecosystems. It brings in other layers of value into these spaces for many landowners. And the way we approach this is, first we want to address the forest health. So we encourage people to work with their CDs, their DNR, their extension foresters, and get a good forest health plan or timber management plan or whatever it is, get that done and get their forest assessed for good health practices. And then we encourage the implementation of many of those forest health practices. So that's kind of a first step. And once those things have been accomplished, then we really look at how we might insert some forest farming practices. And we're not talking about sort of an industrial kind of ag model here. Actually, you see some of that, I would say, on the East Coast with big tracts of ginseng and things like that. You can see more of that monoculture kind of model, but we're really not looking at that approach with forest farming at this point in our forests. And so really looking at bringing in forest farming as a way of increasing management, good forest health management, increasing presence, and building value into these forests beyond, hey, let's mow it down for further ag, or let's turn it into other sources of value that we recognize. Some of the first work that we're doing is the big leaf maple and log grown mushroom trials that Patrick really is the one who has done amazing work with this. And I'm going to actually let him talk a little bit about his work and what he's been doing and seeing.
Sure, thanks, Carrie. And I don't want to take all the credit, that's for sure. The big leaf maple syrup stuff is really interesting partnership between WSU, OSU, and the University of Washington, and hopefully Agroforestry Northwest getting involved too. But this, it's obviously a practice that's more common in the eastern part of the United States, but we've got maple too, and it produces a sugary sap just like sugar maple does. So the whole idea here is developing research and resources, public outreach, public awareness around this very unique Pacific Northwest product, and hopefully creating commercial industry in the process, as well as encouraging people to do it at the hobby scale as well. And some of the benefits there are exactly what Carrie's talking about, is that kind of biocultural element of getting people engaged with their forests, incentivizing proactive management and restoration, and yeah, getting a new product from their forest that they can use for themselves or sell. And I won't get into the nitty gritty of it, but if you're interested in maple syrup production, the season is coming up, and I'd be happy to help you if you wanted to try it out this year. The other component here is the log-grown mushroom trials, particularly shiitake. A colleague of mine at WSU, Justin O'Day, and I have been running trials on this for about 4 years, and seeing if this is a viable practice for supplemental income for forest and farm owners. And it's turning out to be to have a lot of potential, and I'm very excited about it. And I'll say both of these are ways that you can create supplemental income for a farm operation with really low impact on the ecology. To that kind of question we had at the break about taking into consideration rare plants and communities and stuff like that, both of these complement restoration and long-term forest health management really well, and have minimal impact on some of those plant communities. So it's a really exciting way to create a really high value product with minimal space required to begin with and low impact on that space. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah. So this is really the stage and the way we're looking at engaging forest farming into our forests to, really encourage better forest health, better management, and building in these value-added products. Our forest farming as a practice has huge potential in the Pacific Northwest. With these small forest landowners, with these, forests that are adjacent to farmlands. And really, we think and hope if designed, if managed properly, can actually be a complement to healthier forest stands. We have a lot of native species that have huge potential for forest farming within our region. And we also have potential introduced species that have some interesting potential that we are also going to be looking at. One of those is the Camellia sinensis, the tea plant. We have varieties that grow in our region. It is a forest understory plant in its native habitat. It is highly prized when it is grown in shade. It has more health benefits. It is a slow growing thing in a forest ecosystem, so not invasive. That is another thing. We are looking in these spaces at sometimes having species that may not be native. And we are, really conscious of staying away from anything that we either know is invasive or we suspect might be invasive or might become invasive. We really try and do our due diligence to stay away from anything like that when we're looking at other types of species within these ecosystems. Just to touch on lowland farms as well, because these spaces are also dealing with a lot of challenges in our region, increasing regulatory pressures. Our lowland farms are taking on a lot of the water, a lot of the stormwater and surface waters from upland development and clear cutting. A lot of our lowland farms have old and failing drainage infrastructure. We have a change in climate. We have water now coming, the year's worth of water coming now all in the winter and early spring, and then having no water later in the year. We have increasing flooding in our lowlands. We have unpredictable seasons, lots of challenges for our lowland farms. And we are seeing a scenario become more and more prevalent where we have farms that are coming to us, farmers coming and saying, hey, I've got 5 acres or 10 acres that I used to get 3 cuttings of hay off of, or I used to turn my cows out there. And now I can't. The soils aren't drying out. It's too wet. I can't get my equipment out. I can't get my cows out there. I can't get my crops planted when I need to get them in the ground. And I can't get drainage in, right? Getting new drainage into some of these spaces, into these farmlands, can be very costly, very time consuming, and have a lot of regulatory hurdles that need to be navigated. And so farmers are looking for other ways to deal with these newly emerging marginal spaces on their farmlands. And so we are looking at agroforestry applications in these spaces where we can allow the farmlands to take on some of this water, to hold on to some of this water, and function that way, but still be productive with perennial crops, high value perennial crops that can tolerate these sort of new conditions on parts of these farms. So looking at transitioning into these perennial systems, selecting the plants that can tolerate these conditions, looking at planting in the form of food forests and alley cropping types of systems. And to give an example of one of these systems, we planted, I think, 4 of these out last planting season, and we may do some more, not this planting season, but anyway, in the coming next few years. But this is a farm in Arlington called Rooted Northwest. They certainly have areas of this farm that are experiencing these sort of newly emerging marginal conditions. They do have old drainage infrastructure in the form of old tile drains in this farmland. This was an old dairy. Those tile drains are failing. They are not working anymore. And getting those tile drains replaced is just become very onerous. So they have been interested in converting to these perennial systems in an alley cropping system, looking at diverse species rows, and then they will continue to get a cutting of hay out of the alleys for now. As these trees and shrubs get larger and cast more shade, they are wanting then to transition those alleyways into some other type of crop, maybe a medicinal or an herb crop or something like that. What are some of the species that we're finding work here? Aronia berry is one. This is being touted as a new superfood. You see it in showing up in specialty markets. It tolerates these wet, saturated conditions. It can also tolerate drying out in the summer months. Very productive, very hardy shrub that produces this amazing high-value berry. Looking at certain types of willow for cutting for basketry markets, looking at varieties of hazelnuts that do well in these conditions, and also looking at grafting onto native rootstock, actually. So Malus fusca, that does well in these conditions. We can plant that out. We can let it get established, and then we come in later and we graft onto that rootstock in field. And we graft on more commercial varieties of cider apples or dessert apples. Our native Crataegus, the black hawthorn, is another one that we're finding can thrive in these conditions, and that we can come in field and we can graft things like pear and quince onto that native rootstock. So these are some of the types of species that we're exploring in these conditions and planting out these systems that we're calling wet feet farming. So how do we allow for these systems to be planted? How do we educate? How do we move these systems forward? They have the potential to offer a lot of amazing solutions for a lot of the problems we face, especially at the nexus with our private landowners. And a lot of the land that is in private ownership, that we need also to have this good and important ecological restoration, ecological functions and benefits on as well, right? This is really where we're living with these practices. We really, and our private landowners, they need these innovative ways to adapt, right? They need these adaptations to these pressures that they're facing. We need to find better ways to incentivize these landowners to restore and protect these ecosystems. And we need to get at what they value to help them do this. Agroforestry can offer this path. We need to break down silos in land use and in environmental policies and regulations. It can be hard to navigate agroforestry on many landscapes because of the various ways that we have siloed our land use, right? Our land use is forestry, our land use is agriculture, our land use is public parks or whatever it is. We have very, very sort of siloed ways that we break up our landscapes. And we need to be talking about those silos, breaking them down, really integrating departments, integrating institutions towards these more multifunctional types of practices on our working lands. And really, we need to figure out how to reintegrate and recreate some of these healthy relationships in these ecosystem spaces with the increasing number of humans that are going to be present on our landscapes in the coming decades. So, like I said, I already touched on some of this. This is a little bit redundant, but really we need to be addressing silos amongst institutions, policymakers, land owners, land use, and all of that. Really need to be looking at and embracing multifunctional land uses. We need to be educating and training our land stewards and the professionals that work with them, CD folks, extension folks, NRCS folks, all of these different types of people. We need to be working together as institutions around these sort of multifunctional goals, multifunctional uses, and multifunctional practices on our landscapes. With increasing populations and an increasing human presence, we're only going, our land base is not increasing, but the people are. We are only going to be asking more and more and more out of our lands. And so if we can have some of these multifunctional relationship building approaches that we start to figure out now, I'm not saying we have all the answers today, we're working towards these goals. And we need to be doing this now because we're going to be forced to figure this out, I think, in the coming years. And we need to be working to recreate and embracing these reciprocal relationships and what that looks like, right? There's a rich human history of that in this region that has gone on for thousands of years and has only recently been lost. And we need to, reconnect that way of knowing the land. We need to acknowledge that that knowledge still exists. We need to respect it, and we need to give it a more prominent voice in land use and the way that we interact with restoration, with private landowners, and with all of that. When is the best time to plant a tree, right? Climate change is here now. Pressures are here now on our landscapes. And now is the time to really be addressing and finding these types of solutions. Again, I'm Carrie. My colleague here today is Patrick, and this is our contact information. Always feel free to reach out to us. We are interested in educating, in answering questions, in collaborating, in all kinds of things. So absolutely feel free to contact us at any time. And yeah, I hope we have time for some questions, or I mean, it looks like we're almost at noon, but or if I can clarify anything.
Well, thank you so much. That was so informative and fascinating and deeper than I had ever expected this presentation to be. I have a couple of things that I'm curious about adding, given that farms are a place where invasive species really exist, and the forest then is adjacent to this reservoir of propagules, just really clearly integrating like a plan for keeping those areas separate so that we don't just invite not just the wanted species, but everything else. And then I would just ask that for your challenges for lowland folks, or that's a great list. I would just add erosion. The idea of a limited riparian buffer doesn't get at situations where in a native forest with mature conifers, every time there's a disturbance, there's a big pileup of huge trees. And I don't know if we can get at the structural deficit that we have. No other tree that I know of except maybe cottonwoods and possibly maples to some degree, could get at what mature conifers can do for river systems. But anyway, thank you. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, and I do want to talk to that. We're really looking, first and foremost, where we're really looking at these working buffers is on our landscapes where there are no trees. These are private landowners that are putting no trees on their buffers. And a lot of these private landowners, when we approach them with different, incentives and things like that, they're like, no. If I can't touch it, if I can't get production out of this space, if I can't, do some of these things here, if I can't, see my river or whatever it is, then I'm not going to plant any trees. So again, always getting that first zone where we're getting conifers, where we're getting some of those natives that we know we need to have on a lot of our rivers and streams, is the first goal. And then allowing landowners to integrate something that they find useful in there. Again, there are lots of other benefits that riparian forest buffers provide. Habitat, water filtration, all kinds of things, and increasing trees within that zone. What we're finding is at least we're getting an increase of trees and shrubs and perennials within a broader riparian zone when we can offer some of these solutions. And sometimes we're even finding that when landowners feel that they can be a part of the space, even if it's at the margins, sometimes they're much more willing to talk about a riparian planting that gets closer to some of the buffer tables, right? That can be just that piece of the conversation alone can actually be the piece that actually gets them to the table to be like, okay, I'll put 100 feet in, or I'll put 150 feet in if I can tap the big leaf maple in here, if I can grow mushroom logs, if I can have berries integrated at the margins. So it's, yeah, absolutely.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. And I will say too, we're finding, I mean, native or invasive species is a huge issue in our forest lands, in our riparian zones and things like that. What we are finding is when you have more integration of people within the system, the removal of the invasive species can be much more effective because they're present there. They don't want, if they're doing other things within that ecosystem, whether it's restoration, whether it's some kind of cultivation, they're in there more consistently removing those invasive species as well. So it can be very helpful with invasive species pressure.
I don't know if you saw, there's a question from Jill.
Oh no, is there? I'm not looking at the chat. Yeah,
Oh,
sorry.
I can read it. Sorry. She said, Carrie, thank you for the cautionary approach to invasive plants and agroforestry. Appreciated. Can you speak to Paulownia, beautiful wood prized for funerary caskets in Japan and Asia, super fast growing. Oops. So could you speak to Paulownia? Sorry, I lost the rest of the chat.
I saw Patrick nodding his head. Patrick knows it.
Yeah, Patrick, do you want to speak to that?
Oh, I don't know a lot about it. I would just say that good agroforestry would never plant a tree that's going to cause ecological harm to the area around it. So as planners and natural resource professionals, we need to be thinking about not just our space, but the space around it. And I know that's something that is kind of maybe an unspoken component of agroforestry, or not so unspoken. But I would also say I've not heard of any forest or farm owners in this area interested in planting Paulownia myself.
Oh, I know lots of them.
Really?
I know where just about every single one of them is, and I'm just waiting for them to start sprouting up on their own. And nobody will respond to it until it becomes a problem. And it's the number one, it's worse than kudzu in the Southeast United States.
Yeah.
And so I'm just bringing it up. I'm really interested to see how agroforestry ends up integrating, because most programs integrate the noxious weed list for Washington State, which doesn't cover many, many, many plants of concern. And so it's a longer term conversation. And I just want to say, I appreciate so much this. I learned so much today. Thank you. I'll stop here, but I'm going to circle back with you all on it.
Yeah,
Thanks.
we would. Yeah, absolutely, Jill. We'd love to talk more about that.
Okay.
Yeah,
Great.
definitely reach out. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, noxious weeds is a huge concern, right? I mean, you think of all the just backyard gardens around that are adjacent to a stream, or that are, near a forest, or things like that, and things that just escape from someone's backyard garden. Yeah, they're, yeah. Yes, we're, like Patrick said, that's the, if you weren't here for the first presentation when I kind of talked about the 4 eyes, that's another reason why we think it's important to have well-trained agroforestry professionals that landowners can access and reach out to. So we're not getting into scenarios where, someone's just like, oh, I heard about agroforestry and I'm gonna plant all these, things, and they're haphazardly selecting all kinds of invasive species and things like that. The real intentional design and that kind of thing is very important in these systems. So, and that's one of the things that we work towards at Agroforestry Northwest, is really building a good professional base that people can draw from and access.
Yeah, and I just add to it needs to be a part of all of our messaging around agroforestry as well. And a resource development. Carrie and I are on a project right now to develop a handbook for agroforestry design specific to the Pacific Northwest. And maybe, you know, just thinking that's a good opportunity to address that issue of using non-natives in agroforestry and being very careful about which ones
Yeah.
you're selecting.
That's another problem is right now, agroforestry is in our region quite new, right? It's been practiced in the Midwest, it's being practiced in the Northeast, but in our region it's really relatively new. And so when people are out there searching for resources, they're getting resources from the Northeast, they're getting resources from the Midwest, and those resources may not be ecologically appropriate to our region. So that is another big piece of what we do with our organization is we're trying to build that good body of resources that are going to be appropriate for the ecology of our region. Yeah.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. Are there? And I know we're close to time and people may have to move on, but like I said, always feel free to reach out to us if there was a concern or a question that we don't get to answer today, or if you want to learn more about agroforestry or sit in on our work group meetings. They're a great way to ask questions and meet others who are working in this space in our region.
It's super exciting because we really do need those tools. So we see the folks of us on the Olympic Peninsula, you often just see so much pasture land washing into our rivers and causing trouble for landowners downstream, and just doesn't do anyone any good, not fish either, obviously. So thank you for the hope this inspires and energy.
Thank you so much. And I hope this is, as Tammy said, an ongoing conversation. We're all problem solving this and learning together.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Buddy.
So much,
Have a
everyone.
great rest of your day.
Thanks,
Happy
Carrie.
growing.
Thank you, Patrick. Please consider me an ally. Looking forward to working with you, and thanks for your time today. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you.